So you've probably been wondering to yourself, what's this class going to be like? A class that's held sometimes at one location and sometimes online. A class that's so hard to get in during the fall and the spring that many people are eager to take it during the summer. Well, that's what today is all about. This is our first day of class, an intro to communication. And what do I hope to accomplish today is to tell you what this class is all about. It's going to cover really three things, my lecture today. First part is going to be involving talking about the process of communication. And then secondly, I'm going to have you take a look at the syllabus while I also have another video for you posted online talking about that syllabus so you know specifically what the expectations are. And then thirdly and finally, I want to have you take a look at my introductory video and also other students in the class's introductory videos so that we can get to know each other and make some comments about each other, some first impressions, so to speak, which gets the ball rolling for communication. I mean, communication is, after all, something we all do. But do we really understand the complexity of communication? Or do we understand the beautiful simplicity of it? That's why we have a college-level course in communication, an intro to communication. So let me proceed to the first subject today, which is understanding the process of communication. And I want to start with asking, why do we even study communication? If you see me looking, by the way, to the side of the camera right now, it's because that's where my notes are. It's not that I'm not looking you in the eye, which is something that we will study in this class called nonverbal communication and how important it is to look people in the eye. At any rate, back to my question, why do we study communication? We study communication because we know that communication takes place in relationships. We have all kinds of relationships in our lives: friends, virtual friends, parents, teachers, bosses, co-workers, dorm roommates. We have all kinds of relationships, and we know that human beings are social animals. We need contact with other people. Probably the most severe penalty that you can give a human being in their life is to put them in solitary confinement in prison, because what you're really doing is taking away their ability to interact with other human beings. So we know that human beings don't just want to communicate, we have to communicate. I mean, try going the whole day without talking. Can you do it? At some point, you'll just feel a need probably that you have to talk. And within relationships, we know that poor communication happens to be, unfortunately, a leading cause of divorce. We know that many divorces result in people saying, well, communication just stopped between us, or it broke down, or we had poor communication. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, when people are born, children, infants, we know that children who are communicated with constantly, they grow up healthier, both mentally and physically. That's why parents, and specifically mothers, are often taught to talk to their children while they're in the womb. And also in our relationships, we use communication to learn from other people. I'm sure that some of you in this class already know each other, or if you don't, the first day of class, as you're sitting there, you'll start to ask things like, am I in the right place? Have you ever taken this guy before? Questions like that. We use communication to learn from each other. But that's not the only reason we study communication. We also study communication because of its importance to society. In fact, communication establishes our identities in the context of society. For example, are you a skateboarder? Are you a snowboarder? Are you a rock fan? A country music fan? Are you a sports fan? Are you a person who likes to eat vegetables? Are you a person who takes vacations as often as you can? This is how we learn to represent ourselves to others in society. It's through communication. We communicate with others, we develop our own identities, which are constantly being changed and improved upon, hopefully. But we do that in the context of the larger society that exists around us. So that makes communication both an art and a science. It's an art because it's a very creative enterprise. There's no one specific way to communicate all the time that works in all situations. That makes it creative. It makes it unique. And also, communication is unique because it can be beautiful. Have you ever received a poem from somebody, for example? Or has somebody ever said something to you that really hit home? That's the creativity and the art of communication. But communication is also a science. It's a science because we know that there are certain techniques that we can use to communicate with another person efficiently. For example, we know that when we go to a job interview, we are expected to sit down we're expected to shake hands first and then sit down properly and then to take the nod from the interviewer as to what we should talk about. That makes it somewhat of a science. It's predictable. It has certain categories that we go through. And so communication in society is something that is both an art and a science. Now let's move on to defining communication. We sort of just did define communication in one way. We said it's both an art and a science, but communication is also simple and complex, as I mentioned at the outset of campus. You can say, for example, if somebody stops by your room and say, hey, a bunch of us are going out later tonight, you can say, no, I'm not going to join you guys tonight. And it could be as simple as the other person saying, okay, they're just not in the mood or they're tired. But also your words could create a lot of confusion in the mind of the other person. Don't they like me? Was it something I said? Don't they like who I'm hanging out with? Is something wrong? And all of this can be fueled even more by social media and all the angst that people go through when people don't respond to texts, when people respond with double meanings, etc. So communication is both simple and it's complex. And finally, in defining communication, communication is both intentional and unintentional. It's intentional when you smile at somebody because you really like them and you're glad to see them and you want to show them that. That's intentional. You're trying to show that you're glad to see somebody through your nonverbals. But also communication can be unintentional. I have my arms crossed right now in front of you. This may be something inside of me that's saying, I need to protect myself. And so my arms just go this way without me even realizing it. Communication can be unintentional. You can be caught up in a mood one day where you're really introspective, and somebody else could say, boy, they're really unfriendly. Well, you didn't mean it. It was unintentional. Now let's go on to one of the central points about today's overall discussion, understanding the process of communication, by talking about what makes communication a process. A process is something that, first of all, is ongoing. There is no definite starting point and stopping point of communication. If you have a conversation with somebody in the street and then you go your separate ways, you may still be thinking about it. And in that sense, you're still communicating about it with yourself inside of your head. So communication is a process. It's ongoing. It doesn't start and then it stops. Also, communication cannot be taken back. Now, that's both a good thing and a bad thing. You tell somebody you love them, you tell them once, and they remember that. There was a time which you loved them, even if you don't love them later on. But you've said it and you can't take it back. Also, when you say things in the heat of anger, I hate you, as probably many of you have said. We've all said those words at some point, probably, and it's not something that you can take back. It doesn't mean that you can't ever repair it, but it's out there. Communication is a process. It's something that can't be taken back. And finally, communication is a process because it has a ripple effect. You say things, you do things which communicate things, and you can't always understand what's going to happen after that because there's a ripple effect. So, for example, I called the newspaper delivery service. I said, I don't want to get my newspaper carrier in trouble, but I want to say that every time I go out into my driveway, there's a cigarette butt from where he's turning his car around. Now, I don't know what's happened. I don't know whether he did get in trouble. I don't know whether his feelings are hurt. I don't know whether he's considering the idea of, once again, maybe he wants to quit smoking. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. The point I'm trying to make here, I'm not making a judgment. The point I'm trying to make is that communication has a ripple effect, which also makes it a process. Now let's go on to one of the most important functions of communication, and that is that we create and share meaning through communication. That's how we arrive at meaning. We share it with other people. You go to a baseball game with somebody, you sit down in the stands, there's some exciting plays, you have some jokes, you meet people next to you. All of a sudden, you have a meaning that's come out of that experience that is not shared by anybody else. It's special and unique to you and the person that you went to the game with and the people that you're around with. Now, sometimes we share the same language, but we get different meanings. Like if somebody says to me, "What's up?" I don't assume that I'm supposed to really tell them what's up. Oh, what's up? Well, my wife is in Greece right now with my daughter. My son is over at his friend's house, Nick's. He's got a baseball game tonight. No, that's not what the person often means when they say what's up. They're just kind of saying hello to me. It's a way of breaking down the barrier and doing away with any anxiety that you might have when you see somebody. You kind of break the ice. What's up? Well, sometimes we share the same language, but we get different meanings. Now let's go on to the idea that communication is symbolic. Communication is symbolic because symbols are words, but they are also images and gestures and expressions. And what makes humans different from all the other animals out there is human beings are the only symbol using animals. We have a lot of symbols, and the symbols can vary with just a slight alteration of the symbol itself in terms of their meanings. I mean, this means something very different than if I take just one finger away and then turn the hand around. Now we have a very different symbol with very different meanings. So communication is symbolic, and somewhere along the way, we've assigned those meanings to the symbols. In the US, this means okay. In France, this means zero for most people. And so symbols don't necessarily have an exact meaning that's automatic to their nature. We assign that meaning, and we understand that meaning based on the culture that we come from. Now let's talk about how communication is a discipline. And by that I mean an academic discipline. That's why we have a Department of Communication Studies at East Stroudsburg University, for which I'm the department chair. It's my first time serving as chair. And that's why we have departments of communication all across the world in different universities. But actually communication is a very old discipline. It seems modern because it has a strong technological basis to it. Social media, for example, we think of as communicating. But we can find the roots of communication in ancient Greece. Somewhere around 500 BC, there were a group of people, very famous people, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and others, who started to study communication because they were fascinated at the power of communication. Now, at that time, they studied communication and they called it rhetoric. Rhetoric is a word that you may or may not know. We don't necessarily hear it in good ways these days. We hear it like, don't give me any of your rhetoric, which would tend to mean empty words. But actually, rhetoric is the study of how communication can affect an audience. And so that's what the Greeks did, because they didn't have a written language in 500 BC. Imagine going to the grocery store without being able to make a list. Imagine going to a new city in your car without having Google Maps. Imagine doing anything without having a written language that you can type on a keyboard today. Well, that's the way it was in ancient Greece. And so what that did was it placed a tremendous power of importance on the oral communication skills of people living in ancient Greece. And that's why they developed schools. And that's why Aristotle is known as the father of communication, because he wrote a book called The Rhetoric. And in that book, if you study it at the master's level, or as I did at the Ph.D. level, you learn how strategic you can be with your communication. For example, one of the axioms that came out of The Rhetoric by Aristotle is that the fool tries to persuade me with his or her reasons. The wise person tries to use my own. Now, isn't that fascinating? And so my son said to me the other day, he says, Dad, you always say that you want me to eat something that's good for me. Well, guess what? I have a fever, and I know that if I had an icy from Wawa, it would bring my fever down, and that would be good for me. And I thought, you clever little guy, you're trying to get an icy out of me when you know it's full of sugar, but you know what? I'm going to get it for you because you kind of have a point. Now, you've just used my reasoning to get what you want. That's what the Greeks studied. It's fascinating to study the Greek study of rhetoric. Now let's move on. Let's talk about communication and what it consists of in terms of the basic elements. And for this, I'm going to refer you to a link that I put under the Content tab that will show you a communication model. It is not the exact model that I'm going to cover, but it will come close. This model is like a model airplane. It shows you an entire airplane. That's what a model airplane does. Whereas if you were to look at the airplane in person, it would be hard to see the whole thing because it's so big. So a communication model shows you the basic elements of communication. And in the communication model, we start with communicators. Those are people who are initiators and interpreters. The initiator is somebody who starts a conversation, what's up? And the interpreter is somebody who responds by interpreting the comment. Not much. So I've interpreted that comment and I'm not really supposed to answer it in full. I'm just going to say not much. You've got an initiator and an interpreter. Sometimes in communication models, those people are also called the sender. The initiator is called the sender, and the interpreter is also sometimes called a receiver. Now, when these two interact, another element that goes on in the communication model is encoding, and then another element is decoding. Encoding is putting your thoughts into symbols. You come out of an exam, your friend is there, they say, how'd you do? You go like this. You are putting into a symbol, you're encoding into the symbol the idea that you did well on the exam. So decoding is how the interpreter interprets the symbols. So the person who sees this is saying they not only did well, but they did really well. Hey, buddy. So now let's move on to the next element, which is messages. That's my little dog. He's not in the picture right now. You hear something outside, it's probably a deer. So the next up in the communication model is the message. This is the content of your communication. It consists of your ideas, your thoughts, and your feelings. And it includes both verbals, the things that you say, and it also includes the nonverbals, your facial expressions, your gestures, the way that you inflect in the communication. Now let's go on to the next element of the model, and that is the channel. This is the medium that carries the communication. Now, in this class, we will have two media at play. That's the plural of media. We will have the internet, which we're going to be using for our online Tuesday classes. And then we have our in-class face-to-face time, which is using thin air, so to speak, seeing each other in person. Now, we know that channels affect communication very much. There are advantages to certain channels that there aren't for other channels. For example, let's say you run out of money at college and you want to ask your parents for more money. How are you going to do that? Are you going to do that by text? Are you going to do that by calling them on the phone? You're going to do it in person. Some people would say I want to text because I'm too embarrassed and I don't want to experience my parents getting disappointed in me that I've already spent my money. Others would say, no, I want to go home and I want to talk to them face to face so they can see that I'm really sincere about how badly I need money. So the channel affects communication, and it's one of the elements in the model. Next up is the element of noise. Noise is anything that gets in the way of communication. And you have internal noise and you have external noise. Internal noise is something that's inside of you that's getting in the way. Like you're preoccupied and you're not listening to your roommate because you're thinking of something else. Or you're feeling ill. Or you're just daydreaming. Those are internal noises. External noises are things like my dog that gets in the way. They bark. Or there's somebody standing in front of you and you can't see the concert. Or there's loud talking out in the hallway while you're trying to take a class. That's external noise, and that's another element of the model. Then there is the element of feedback. Feedback is the reaction to your message. So if you're in an argument with somebody and you start to talk to them and they start to roll their eyes and they start to cut you off, they're saying, I don't want to hear what you have to say. They may even be saying, just by their body language, I've already heard this many times, so I don't want to hear it again. That's feedback. It comes to you from facial reactions, from verbal cues, etc. Later on in class, while I'm talking, if I see people trying to write and it looks like they're not keeping up, that's feedback I should be using to say, I need to slow it down. Just two more elements to consider here. Next is context. And context is the environment that surrounds the communication. We know that people develop histories with each other, and when they first start talking, there's very little context. But after they know each other for a while, when you've been living with your roommate for a long time and you know that you have standard disagreements, for example, over how to keep the room clean, you know that that context is going to influence how you communicate about it. Like maybe you might say to yourself, I just give up. I know I can't get my roommate to keep the room the way that I want to. And so the context influences communication very much. Now, within context, we know that there are various dimensions of communication, various settings is probably a better way to say it. And I just want to take a moment to describe these contexts because this will lay out for us the rest of the class. We know that we have an intrapersonal communication context. Intra, that's where you're communicating inside of your head. Like when you try to psych yourself up to take an exam. I know this question. I know I can do it. Or when you're playing a sport like basketball, I know I can get that through the hoop. I'm visualizing. It's intrapersonal communication, communicating inside of your head. That's different from the next context, which is interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication is simply communication between two people. And that makes it very, very relationship-based between two people who are intimate or two brothers, two sisters, etc. Interpersonal communication is just communication between two people. Next up is small group communication. That's a group of 3 to 7 people meeting as a team, meeting as a workforce, meeting as a task force, meeting as a committee, meeting as a commission. These are all different structures for small groups. You may find yourself on one of those small groups. The communication that takes place in small groups is very special because of the group context. Next up is the context of public communication. That's speaking in public, speaking in front of an audience, 15 people or larger, like I probably will be doing in this class if we have 15 people, or speaking to a group of people that you're training at your job, or speaking to a group of people at a camp where you're the counselor. These are examples of public communication. And then finally, we have mediated communication or mass media. And this is a type of communication that goes through technology like television or Twitter or radio or newspapers and goes to masses of people, millions, thousands, hundreds. That's mediated communication. So those are the different contexts of communication. We're going to be going through each and every one of those in this class and having assignments designed around them. Well, we got a little bit deviated there, but that does take us to our last element of the communication model, and that is culture. And culture is really your way of life, which has a lot to do with where you grow up, not just in Pennsylvania, but in the Northeast or in the United States compared to Britain, for example. This is your culture. And culture very much impacts the way that you communicate. We know, for example, in Mexico, when you pass somebody on the street, you're supposed to wave and smile. If you don't, you're not wishing a Mexican good health. So you wave and you smile to wish them good health. In Pennsylvania, when we pass people, we're kind of taught to keep to ourselves. We don't want to get involved. We're busy, could be dangerous, passing an unknown person on the street. Often we don't say hello. And so there you have it. This is going to wrap up our first lecture for the class, our first online lecture. And now your task is to go on to watch the video for the syllabus that I have created, and then after that to watch the introductory videos for the class. I look forward to meeting you all in person tomorrow night.